dialogue with Professor Biao Huang from Zhejiang University. This dialogue called Sino-US Scholar Dialogue Series on Public Administration is jointly held by the School of Public Affairs, Zhejiang University, and the section on Chinese Public Administration of American Society for Public Administration. And Dr. Liang Lu of City University of New York, currently our section chair, and also Dr. Weiwen Zhang, Associate Dean of the School of Public Affairs at Zhejiang University. They jointly organized this series. Previously, we invited speakers from the US, China, and other countries and regions to talk about most recent topics like healthcare reforms and also policy analysis. We are happy that we can include some of the leading scholars and practitioners in the field of public sector innovation to share with us their insights into government innovation under the pandemic. I know that lots of people are talking about the post-pandemic era, but we should actually focus on what's going on and what happened during the pandemic, and to see what we can promote government innovation in the post-pandemic era. So I'll first invite Elaine to give a welcome speech, and then Weiwen will also give a welcome speech. So Elaine.
Sure. Thank you, Liang. Welcome everybody to this fourth installment of a 6-part dialogue series co-organized by the section that I happen to be a chair for, as well as Zhejiang University. So my name is Liang Lu. I am a professor and the director of the John Jay College at the City University of New York. And for those of you who know our section, I just want to plug in. We are actually a nice, warming, heartwarming section. We have lots of people engaged in research, and that's the part I'm very, very proud of. So every single lecture, I can tell you, it's like attended by more than 100 people, and I think we will be. Not only becoming a research community, but also a community who extends helping hand to younger generations of scholars, as well as welcoming diverse of thoughts. I'm very glad that Professor Liang and Professor Huang are our topic leaders for this section, and they are picking on the topic of public innovation. I think, living in New York City, what I learned from that pandemic is that we really need to innovate, to pivoting to agility, and to really think outside the box, how to handle things like incredible surge of online usage during pandemic, as well as how to translate information into different languages to fit the diverse demographics in the New York City area, for instance. So I'm very glad that you guys are organizing such a relevant topic. And I extend my welcoming heart and the hands and the feet or whatever you can think of, just join our section. And the secretary of the section, Han Jing, who is also a PhD student on the market, she will be sending out in the chart how to join our section. So believe me, you will not regret today's decision to join our section, because it provides tons of services to you guys. So with that being said, I'm leaving a little bit, because I just so happens my own presentation is at the same time, so I will come back when I can. All right, so I wish all the best of luck for you guys. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. So Weiwen.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. Yeah. Thank you, Ma Liang. Okay, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, friends, good morning, good evening. Thank you from different parts of the world to participate in Sino-US Scholar Dialogue series on public administration. On behalf of School of Public Affairs, Zhejiang University, I would like to extend my warmest welcome and sincere thanks to all the guests and participants. It's great to meet with you. Located in Hangzhou, one of China's most picturesque cities, Zhejiang University is one of China's top higher education institutions, as well as one of its oldest. Founded in 2005, School of Public Affairs insists on being a leading public administration school and a pioneer in digital governance in China with complete disciplines, remarkable achievements, strong social influence. Adhering to the model of world affairs as responsibility and truth as faith, SPA is committed to excellence in teaching, learning, and research, and to nurturing leaders in many disciplines who makes a difference within the nation and across the globe. Currently, we have more than 120 faculty members and almost 3,000 degree-seeking students. Besides, we provide 2 English-taught master programs, MPA, which is accredited by NASPA. Another is a foreign aid training program for Ministry of Commerce. Additionally, special thanks to our partner, SAPA, who worked with us for several months and gave us great support during this special period. We believe that we would get together in person in Hangzhou very soon. So enjoy this academic feast. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vivian. I'll invite our speakers to share their insights into public innovation under the pandemic. And we have 3 speakers. Each of them will spend 15 to 20 minutes to share with us their findings and reflections. And then we'll invite Professor Frances Berry from Florida State University to share with us her discussions and comments. So we'll first invite Mehmet Demircioglu, assistant professor from Liang School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And his topic is COVID-19 and the new norm of public sector innovation. Mehmet has been published a lot in the field of public sector innovation. And I believe that his latest research will give us more thoughts about what's going on and what will happen relevant to government innovation. So welcome, Mehmet.
So thank you very much, Dr. Liang. So it is great to see everyone. So I know all of you, and I'm very honored to be a part of this dialogue series. And I'm very happy to be also with Sid, Alex, and all other speakers that I admire their work, since I'm a PhD student, and most of my work isn't from the Australian government. So I find the Alex work so beneficial to my career, and of course. Dr. Berry was also very influential in terms of innovation diffusion. So I'll talk about mostly on COVID-19 and new normal of public sector innovation, and also linking to some of my latest work or previous work, and how can maybe we see the future in terms of the scholarship of public sector innovation. And I just want to start with the quote from one of the, I think, excellent colleagues, colleagues in Australia. And so I believe this is the last sentence of the article that I just provide here. If ever there was a time for public administration and management scholars to make that difference, it is now. And I believe that we are making difference in terms of innovation here, and hopefully we can make difference in terms of other subfields or under public administration and management. And so how can we approach innovation from the angle of new normal or COVID-19? So one of the findings or assumption or a fact is, well, COVID-19 is a grand challenge. It is a wicked problem. We don't know the answer very well. It is kind of, there is a VUCA world, uncertain, complex, and so forth. And so the question is, if COVID-19 is a grand challenge, and then we can solve or we can maybe provide insights using the wicked problems. And these are, one is innovation. So maybe we may approach COVID-19 with using innovation, and also they are all linking to each other, perhaps with using also technologies and maybe technological innovation, more entrepreneurship, such as exploring and exploitation of opportunities. But maybe the recent or important discussions today as well, it is from the more public policy cycle discussions, government capacity. So what matters most would be those countries who have higher state capacity, as they can handle it well. But there are, I think, two somewhat like question mark I put. There is an assumption that, well, or maybe assumption for the wicked problems, maybe we need more collaboration to solve the problems. And I'll explain it more. I disagree for some parts, I agree with other parts. And also, we also see perhaps increasing roles of the government and somewhat like economics theories, maybe Austrian school. Well, if the government's role is increasing, then perhaps we may have less autonomy as citizens as well. So I don't really talk about the philosophy of the idea, but I'll provide a few evidence about the government's role for innovation. So let me link two of my studies on the previous studies, and whether these conditions are still relevant for COVID-19. So one of the early papers, David and I look at whether there would be any conditions for innovation. And we published the work in research policy. So we find that these four conditions matter for innovations. There should be an experimentation, and there should be responding low performers, and we need to provide feedback, and also motivation to improve performance. And we didn't find any effect from the resources or the budget, like the last year's budget. And in particular, the first and fourth condition, experimentation and motivation to improve performance, makes a big difference in the public sector. And I also read the book so many years ago. It was one of my favorite books. And it is a picture phone. Maybe it is also relevant today. So although the name is picture phone, actually it is a video call that we are making right now, like Zoom call, right? So, and the idea is that when I read the book, although I didn't refer in the paper, we didn't refer the book, but we see the experimentation like for this kind of invention, and we see like feedback loops, and we see like these engineers, these scientists have motivation to make difference. And one difference, of course, is these agency or like Bell Factory, which works under AT&T at that time, had huge budgets and huge resources. So that may be one biggest difference. However, the other four conditions are actually very significant. And the following study, and David and we also look at, well, what about the conditions for complex innovations? And I don't want to go over like what is complex and so forth, but complex is more about somewhat radical. And we came to framework or theoretical framework that perhaps for complex innovations, we may need to understand more systematic way. For individuals, we need the creative people. At the group level, they need to cooperate. At the organizational level, there should be higher quality of leadership, encouraging innovation, as well as the climate of innovation. And in the external environment level, collaboration with other agencies, and plus working in a complex environment. And if we link to these like Bell Labs, I think we see all of the factors dominant. But if you look at also the COVID-19, and there is a very complex environment, agencies are collaborating with each other, and we see that perhaps it may be maybe same conditions for innovation. However, I think maybe we can call limitation of these two studies is that we assume that, or our data actually show that things are stable, not too different. We don't have any crisis. And of course, if you ask me, like, what is the biggest condition for innovation in the during COVID-19, and I'll say you, well, the COVID-19 itself is the biggest driver or the conditions making the innovation. And let me also give an example here and link to also the government's role for the innovation. As you can see from the picture and the figure here, this slide is about NASA and sending people to moon in 1960s or maybe missions. So we call it mission-driven innovation or mission innovations. And Alex has important work on mission innovations as well as many scholars in the United Kingdom. And so here, what I want to tell you, I maybe mentioned briefly here, and also linked to COVID-19, it also demonstrates the government's role. Well, today NASA has less than 0.4% of budget, operating budget, but in the 1960s, it was close to 5%, like more than 10 times of today. So, and it demonstrates that, well, kind of features thinking. And of course, there was a Cold War going on with United States and with Soviet Union. So, and the government's role was mostly about not only funding, but also providing supporting institutions for this mission or this critical innovation. And when they achieve their goals, well, the budget becomes stable over the years. And as the quote mentions here, there were no real precedents, no established ways of performing tasks. And this era is basically based on the freedom and little existing legacy. So much experimentation and plus government support, managerial support, and also like technological support as well. And if we consider COVID-19 as a crisis that maybe we need to all handle with, and we may perhaps, or maybe some governments are approaching from that way, perhaps providing some resources and maybe for vaccines or some technological innovations, and then perhaps it can be like solved. And when things become stable, and you may reduce the government budgets for those type of innovations. And let me also like mention one of the, maybe a few of my papers. So I wrote the piece with two of my students, and here we look at kind of public servant of the future. And we wrote the piece before the COVID-19. And so I know many of you have also contributed these excellent handbook, like with Helen Sullivan Dickinson and Hailey Henderson. So here, even before the COVID-19, so the third author, Archie, so she's in India, when she was a master's student, she was interested in kind of features thinking and how feature organizations can be designed. And so we came together, three of us, with Roberto, and we mentioned that perhaps like we would see more data centricity or collaborative mindset, tech-savvy approach, but instead of emotional intelligence, we see more maybe emotional intelligence. And I think our predictions are relevant during the COVID-19, and perhaps we may see more flexibility, like mobility and social responsibility, and the companies are, I think, aiming to make. And for another paper, although it is not relevant to COVID-19 itself, because we wrote it before, some of the scholars, like they look at leadership behavior and how they impact to innovate maybe other outcomes like motivation. In this paper, we look at how those three types of behavior, task-oriented, relations-oriented, and change-oriented leadership, how they impact entrepreneurship. And so we find that what matters most is relations-oriented leadership. So if we see more managers who emphasize more relations-oriented leadership, such as employees' well-being and employees like supporting employees, empowering them, and employees tend to be more innovative and entrepreneur. And I believe that same is true for COVID-19. And we see that the managers who are more relations-oriented leaders, who listen to employees, their concerns and their needs, and so that employees tend to be more like trusting to managers, trusting to organizations. And as a result, they tend to be maybe more innovative. Of course, change and task-oriented leaderships are also like positively affecting and the response. And so in the one of the recent works, Archie and my colleague from Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, and we look at like we analyze over 150 documents, including like magazines, newspapers, websites, and close to 200 actually. And these are the findings, the work, and we see an increasing trend to adoption of telework and digital tools, both at the organizational level and individual level. And we also link to the sustainability of organizations. So those organizations which provide the implementation or support for implementation, and we see more sustainability in the jobs, in the new normal. And the third major finding was overall there is an increase in the flexibility in organizations, both in the private, but also in non-profits and public organizations as well. And this was the kind of typology that we came with. So two trends: one is telework, and the second is digital adoption. And I think our Zoom conversation consists both of them, like telework and digital adoption. And of course, there are implications to organizations and individuals as well. Some are negative, like we see more social isolation. Some are more positive, and such as governments tend to be more innovative, at least from the like technological side. And however, another negative aspect is rise in cyber threats, and but we see maybe more managerial support to increase adoption of technologies as well. And of course, we may be wrong for some of the assumptions. And so my final paper that I would like to maybe provide some brief information. So it will be a forthcoming piece in the Frontiers in Public Health. So I wrote the piece with two of my students. They took my innovation class last summer, and they mostly look at like 23 Asian countries as a systematic review and meta-analysis. And so basically we covered major Asian countries, including like China, Singapore. And so these are the findings of our work. And effective and agile leadership, but we find that in some cases, maybe like Singapore or maybe China, the political leadership, in maybe Singapore also bureaucratic leadership, but in some cases, maybe Indonesia, we see like community and religious leadership, they can make a big difference when the measures are become more successful or innovations. Because I didn't see actually discussion on religious leadership, so it was kind of interesting to me, although I see discussions in community leadership from like Nordic countries or European, some of the studies in Europe. And we also find that high-skilled public sector workforce, along with communication with public and additional like resources, like it also linked to government's role. Perhaps one of the government's role is providing resources and also using ICT, maybe smartphone applications. And they make, I think, big difference and in terms of the features of innovation as well as success of the policies. And I can also link to the other slide I mentioned. Perhaps we need to combine relations-oriented leadership, change-oriented and task-oriented leadership with providing some flexibility. So let me summarize or conclude my talk. During the COVID-19, the major driver or condition for innovation is externally driven, which is the COVID-19 itself. And in many cases, the resources and state capacity makes a big difference in terms of innovations, but in terms of the performance and in terms of like receiving vaccines and so forth. And we also see perhaps different types of innovation, in some cases product or technological, in some cases like communication or marketing innovation from government to the citizens. And here is my disagreement with excellent scholars, like what I mean, scholars like Sorensen, Torfing, and so there are a few more, like I admire their work, but in terms of their argument that, well, during the COVID-19, or we may see more collaboration. And I simply disagree, at least from my observation. And what I see here is that there is more rigidity in policies or policy design perspective. And in this case, less collaboration. Like I think yesterday or 2 days ago, Japan and Israel, they closed the borders. I mean, many countries are taking actions. Did they really collaborated with universities or other government or private sector, or no, right? So, I mean, they make the decisions immediately. I'm not saying it is positive or negative, but what I observe is that there is less collaboration when it comes to the design of policies. They need to make the quicker actions. However, when it comes to deliveries of a policy, well, then we may see more collaboration. They say, well, this is our policy. We need to develop this technology. And now we may need to rely on some private organizations. Yes, there is more collaboration here. So I think that will be, I think, one interesting findings of my work or observation at least. And finally, it requires, I think, more relations, change and task-oriented leadership to handle with the COVID-19, as well as aiming more innovations. So thanks again for the opportunity and your patience for listening me for 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mehmet. And thank you very much for sharing with us your recent, I think, at least 6 articles and book chapters. And you talk about whether the context and conditions for innovation are still relevant and similar before and during the pandemic. And I think this kind of discussions are very insightful. So let's move to our second speaker, Professor Jessica Teets from the Political Science Department of Middlebury College. And her topic is exploring political personalities, the micro foundation of local policy innovation in China. I know Jessica published a lot in Chinese local policy innovation, and she did a lot of interviews in China. And I'm looking forward to her findings. And also, I guess she will share with us lots of interesting stories during her field work. Yeah.
I don't know if I'll live up to all of those promises, but I'll do my best. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And I also wanted to thank the organizers, as well as Ma Laoshi and Huang Laoshi for inviting me. Ma Laoshi was very nice and gave a really long lecture to my students several years ago when we were in China, and so I really owe him. So let me go ahead and get started. My topic isn't exactly about COVID, although I think the implications have to do with COVID. So you'll see how these are all related if you hang on with me for a little bit longer. But I wanted to talk a little bit about trying to understand the explanations for policy innovation in China, And the reason that this is, I think, a really interesting puzzle is that if you ask a lot of people, definitely outside of China, maybe inside of China as well, about the way that the government works in China, most of the time people will talk about the large bureaucracy, right? So the party state, it's a really, really large bureaucracy that runs the entire country. And here's a picture of a group of leaders, and they probably didn't receive a memo to dress exactly the same way, but that tends to be the image that's portrayed. And so for a lot of people, when they're looking at China, they think about a large bureaucracy, they think about a lot of similarity, people acting the same way, and they don't necessarily think about innovation. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of us. When we think about big bureaucracies, we don't tend to think about innovation, right? But what's interesting in the case of China is that we actually see a lot of innovation in China. And so this is just a map showing the special economic zones that were policy experiments that were used to transition the economy of China from a state-planned economy to a market-based economy. And you can see here, if you look at the dates, that these policy initiatives or experiments, they were started in some areas and then they were changed slightly and adopted in other places. We also don't have to look too far back into history. We can also see that there are more modern experiments. This is looking at the low carbon city experiment, and these are all the different places that have adopted different experiments. So what we see then is we actually see, even though we have a really large bureaucracy in China, we actually see a lot of experimentation. So how do we explain that? How do we understand that? Most of the literature in this area really focuses on structural incentives, mostly promotion. And so, and I've listed a couple of authors for people who aren't as familiar with this literature, but want to do a little bit more reading. But most of these authors are really focusing on this idea of promotion, and that government officials at the subnational level are innovating as a way to get promoted. And so whether or not the innovation itself gets them promoted, it's also sending a signal, right? That I'm an innovative leader, I'm trying to solve these problems. So this is what we see in the majority of the literature. And the way that this works, or what the causal logic of this argument is that all of the government officials who are in the bureaucracy are evaluated each year using a personnel management system. And this personnel management system assigns points for performance, right? And so this is how you get a large group of people to act in similar ways. And what we find with research done at lower levels of government is that these incentives matter all the way down. So through all the different levels of Chinese government, we see that government officials are saying, we know that this is what's used to evaluate our performance. We know that it's important. And for those of you who haven't seen examples of what these evaluations look like, this is taken from an article about promoting city leaders. So this is a city level evaluation. What's on there isn't so important. What's important to note is that you can see that the targets are pretty specific and that there are certain points that are available for hitting those targets. So it's fairly easy to see why this explanation is so predominant in the literature. It's pretty clear to see that if you're, somebody who wants to get promoted or you want to get a raise, your path forward in the system is pretty clear, right? And so if you solve problems at the local level and you're able to achieve high performance, you get promoted. The problem with this literature is that there have been a lot of studies showing that the logic just doesn't really work most of the time. And what we find, and there's a large literature here, so I won't try to go over it all in my 20 minutes, but we just see that there are a lot of reasons that people are finding that local officials in China are adopting policy experiments, and that it's not necessarily because of the evaluation system. So so a lot of the literature just looks at governability, right? That there are local officials who are working in certain areas and there are such extreme problems that they're just not able to govern their area without addressing those problems. And so they're trying to solve those problems. It's a really practical or functional argument. We also see that there are lots of things that get in the way of this performance management system really determining people's behavior. And so this is your age in the system. At some point, you know, that this promotion incentive doesn't really work for you, as well as what your terminal position will be in this system. We also see some new research that's come out looking at how individual this process is, in that in doing interviews with local officials who are innovating, that they're not really talking as much about being promoted as they're talking about that they think that they know the solution to a problem and they want to adopt that solution because they're trying to, you know, make life better in China, that they're public servants. And so we've seen this sort of explosion of literature that really is showing us that this structural logic of the reason that people are innovating is to get promoted doesn't really hold in that many cases. And so what we tried to do in our research is we tried to look at a more evolutionary model, and we tried to look at what was happening as the structure, or those extrinsic motivations like promotion, were interacting with some of these other more intrinsic or individual factors. And the reason that we wanted to undertake this research is, first of all, through a lot of interviews, we were already talking to people who were saying things like, well, this is what it takes to get promoted, but this is why I'm also doing it. And so we knew that there was an interaction there, but we also see in the bigger political science literature that there's been a lot more research done on individual level traits and how these actually predict things like voting behavior. Also, in the policy innovation literature, there's been a pretty expansive literature looking at policy entrepreneurs, right? And so these are looking at individual level characteristics that are then encouraging people to innovate. And so oftentimes these are risk propensity, or people's willingness to take on risk, as well as this idea of feelings of personal efficacy, right? So just the idea that you can actually do something as an individual, you can solve a problem in your community. And so what we argue then is we argue that these individual preferences matter and that they're really important, but they are mediated through this institutional incentive system that we see in China. So of course, that's easy to say, right? Now you have to show how much these things matter and how they interact. So the way that we tried to get at this is we did surveys with local government officials. As you might expect, this is really challenging. At the time we were trying to do the surveys, the anti-corruption campaign was targeting local officials, and this was really sensitive. So we tried to do our survey originally through 2 different companies, including universities that do surveys that I've worked with in the past. And they all said that it was too sensitive and they weren't willing to do it. So we found a backdoor, which was basically that we partnered with friends of ours who work at universities that do cadre training courses in the summer. And we asked them to administer our surveys to the cadres in their classes. So this was great. We got almost 1,000 responses, but the problem is, you know, it's not random sampling. It's not fully representative. So there are problems with it, but this is the only way that we could get to this specific population. So that's what we went with. And what we saw was that as far as age and position, the sample was actually pretty good, but we see that as far as where the officials are from, that we see a slight skewing towards the more developed provinces, as you can see with these numbers, right? Shandong, Guangdong, Zhejiang, these are all pretty developed provinces. So we do see that slight bias. So just keep that in mind as we talk about the results. So what we tried to do then is in the survey, we tried to ask questions measuring this idea of policy personalities, or in the political science literature, it's sometimes called political personalities. And so we tried to look at how local government officials understood sources of policy making. So who were they learning from? Who did they think could be a policy maker or participate in the process? We also tried to evaluate those questions of risk and policy efficacy that appears in the policy entrepreneur entrepreneurship literature. And then we also tried to get at that selection mechanism, right? So for the external structure, what did they think was important? Is it the cadre evaluation system? Is it public pressure? Or from Liang's research, is it in fact the competition with their peers, right? These are the sorts of explanations we were trying to test. And the way that we did this is we were trying to not deductively figure out what these personalities were, but to let the patterns in the survey data show us inductively what we're seeing as far as different types of personalities. And so we used principal component analysis to group similar personality types together so that people who answered the survey in the same ways would get grouped together. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then the second stage of our model was we used the predicted values of the personality types that were dominant in our data set. So we used that in ordered logit models along with a question about, are you willing to innovate in recent years? And I'll explain why we phrased the question that way in a second. So there are two stages to the model. First, figuring out who's in our data set, what are the policy personalities, and then trying to figure out, do they matter, right, for innovation? And so I just wanted to show you some of the questions. I can go through this in more detail later on. I don't want to take up too much time, but you can see some of the questions that we're trying to ask, trying to figure out sort of a top-down mentality, like are cadres looking up and that's what matters to them, or are they looking at society and that sort of feedback matters to them. But we also try to get at those policy entrepreneurship ideas of risk and efficacy. And you can see the efficacy questions, I think, are pretty clear. The risk question, we got at that using an experimental question where we tried to figure out what their risk tolerance was. And so we borrowed from the economics literature to ask a question about, would you adopt a new policy if the chance of it being successful is 30% likely, 50% likely, 70% likely? And we sort of gave them a little scenario about what the policy was. So that's what we did for the survey. And then what we found was that the components in the principal component analysis were stacking in 4 main ways. And so these are our 4 main personalities. The first you can see is what we're calling a consultative leader. And this is somebody, if you look at the factors that are loading here, this is somebody who's really focused on solving problems in their community, right? That person who appears in the literature who's trying to solve local problems. But that other person in the literature who's just innovating in order to get promoted is here also, right? We call that person the strategic autocrat. What they're doing is they're strategically navigating the cadre evaluation system and using innovation as a signal that they should be promoted. We also find that bureaucrat that we sort of all expected, right? So not really interested in innovating, being afraid of failure mostly, right? But we also found that policy entrepreneur, so that person that is willing to take on a lot of risk, they really believe in their own efficacy, so one's own skill, individual preference, learning from past experiments. So these are the 4 different personality types that represented the largest components in the data set. And so then the next stage that we did was we tried to figure out, does it matter? So what we did then is what we're seeing when Xi Jinping takes over in China between 2012 and 2013 is we see a decline in policy innovation. And most of the literature suggests that there's increased risk, increased uncertainty, and so people are just not experimenting. So all of those local officials who were experimenting have stopped because of the structural conditions. Well, what our model shows is that is in fact true, but it's not even. It varies across those personality types. So the way we tried to get at this, because we couldn't ask in our survey, you know, hey, has Xi Jinping increased the risk and uncertainty and have you stopped innovating? We couldn't ask that question. So instead we phrased it as, do you think that local officials have been unwilling to innovate in recent years? And that's sort of how we got at this change. And I won't go through the whole model unless people are interested, but you can see the personality index is highly significant. And then we tried to control for those other variables we talked about. But the important part is that you can see that the strategic autocrat, that person who is innovating just to get promoted, he's very affected by this change. He's stopping innovating. It's the primary reason that he's stopping innovating. You also see that the autocratic bureaucrat has also stopped innovating. Right? However, if you look at that citizen-oriented local official, this is the person who's innovating because there are local problems that they want to solve, or that policy entrepreneur, that one who's willing to take on risk and uncertainty in order to have, a successful policy experiment. I think about that person as like a policy technocrat. But anyway, those people, you see that they are still willing to innovate. So even though risk and uncertainty are increasing and they're not willing to innovate at the same level as before, they're still willing to innovate. So why does this matter? Well, first of all, it matters because we might see changes in structural conditions, but they might impact different personalities in different ways. So just seeing that there's a more restrictive environment doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will stop innovating. Some people will continue to innovate, right? Now, what we see, though, is that with COVID, there's even more uncertainty and risk. And so we would expect then that would also have a dampening effect on innovation. So what does this mean then for understanding the future of policy innovation in China if we see that the levels of risk and uncertainty remain really high? One is that overall, we're going to see that the people do stop innovating, right? That it's not as prevalent. We don't see as many policy experiments. So the only policy experiments that you should expect to see are the ones that are centrally designated, right? So these are the ones that the central government says, we're looking for volunteers to do this. And so local governments sign up, but they're all designed and guided by the central government. And then the other outcome we expect is that those policy entrepreneurs and those locally oriented, citizen-oriented officials, they will continue to try to solve local problems, but they won't try to share that information out. So they won't really publicize that they're doing these innovations. So that learning and diffusion that we saw in those earlier models, we wouldn't expect to see that as much, just because they'll only be focused on solving a local problem and not sharing it more broadly. Okay, let me go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you very much, and I look forward to feedback.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for your very interesting findings talking about their personality and their relevance to innovation in local China. And I found that we can see innovations are persistent, but there are some structural change in terms of who and how to innovate. For instance, you may continue to talk about innovation strategies. As you mentioned, people would do it but not speak out. And I think that this and other innovation research will help us to better understand the current practices and the future development of local innovation in China. So let's move to our third speaker, Alex Robas. Currently, he's the director of IPA Ventures, IP Australia. Previously, he was with OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, which is very important to the development of innovation in public sector in Europe and the world. So his topic is burning platforms and pandemics are not enough. The limits of a crisis in driving public sector innovation. And I guess Alex's presentation will be a good dialogue with Mehmet's previous presentation. So welcome, Alex. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be a part of this. So yes, I'm speaking very much from a practitioner point of view, as someone who's been trying to engage and push innovation in the public sector over a number of years, most recently at the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. And I guess this sort of builds on a couple of points from the past two presenters, in that Mehmet mentioned that a lot of innovations are externally driven, and that's very true. But we have to ask the question, well, is that something that we're satisfied with? Because if we're forever responding we're generally going to be always disappointing. If you're relying on a burning platform to drive change, you're going to get your feet burnt. And if you're relying on a crisis to change things, you're very much going to be seeing a lot of more symptomatic responses rather than changes driven by public goals and values. And just to Jessica's point, I mean, I think she laid out really well how structural forces shape how individuals engage with innovation and when they might engage with innovation. But the problem there is innovation is a muscle that we need to have in readiness at all times. If we don't have people engaging innovation, their ability to innovate when it comes to a crisis or something is not going to be as good as if they're innovating on an ongoing basis, even if it might not be as needed at that time. So I'm really wanting to explore a little why we see a lot of innovation in response to crises, but that we need to move beyond that. So my first point, at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, there was an effort to collect a lot of examples of innovation in response to the pandemic. We saw around the world all sorts of examples, and I just picked this one as one of my personal favorites of a primary school in China where they asked students to create 1-meter hats before they came back to school to help these students understand, well, what is social distancing? Because it was a bit of an alien concept. So I think it was a really innovative way of engaging a difficult audience in something that was very different to them. But we saw examples all around the world, and this was by no means an exhaustive list. There were things going on. Some were more easy to spot and to share. Others were much more slower burn or in the background. But we did a bit of an analysis of all of the different types of innovations that were coming out. And there was a lot of concentration in the more sort of immediate symptomatic things. So at the beginning, there was a lot around how do we control how the infection spreads or track where it is? How do we adjust our service delivery in a crisis? How do we redeploy resources to meet the urgent needs? Providing targeted information. My favorite example there was Corona for Kids in Portugal, where they had dedicated communication strategies for children. And there were many, many other responses. But so I guess as you go along these 9, much more was concentrated in the front end, the more immediate symptomatic responses, and less was in the more structural responses and possible longer term shifts. We did see some though. For instance, France, when it negotiated with a bailout with its airline, it said, okay, we'll give you this money, but we need you to stop doing short haul flights where there is already good, fast, high speed rail. So in order to meet our climate obligations. Or for instance, in Paris, they did a lot of work to use the crisis and the suspension of traffic and so on to move people to cycling. So there were some examples where cities, states, countries thought about how to use a short-term crisis for longer-term aims. But most of the time, it was generally about how do we just deal with the immediate crisis? How do we do the job that we need to do without necessarily thinking about that longer term? So I guess I want to suggest that we were really good at symptomatic responses to the crisis. There may be longer term things that are just hard to see, and innovations that have happened that will take time to play out. But if that's the case, I think what we can say is this is but one, albeit very large crisis, but governments have a lot going on. There's a lot that's demanding their attention. We have the longer term consequences of this, whether it's going to be rebalancing public finances, maintaining trust in government, or the renewed debate about, well, what is exactly the role of government? There are new challenges, such as disinformation or critical technologies or the long crisis of climate. And there are other demands. So I'll reinforce that what it's showing is governments need to innovate and innovate. But can we really say innovation embedded in the way that government works? Well, I would suggest not. And that's a problem because given all of these things going on, innovation really needs to be fundamental to how government works. It's very hard to imagine any scenario, any future where government is not going to be a major player in innovating either around policy or services or a whole host of other areas. Well, what we can do though is look at the crisis and say, well, what does it teach us about why crises are good at driving innovation? The pandemic was a really visceral, somewhat brutal illustration of why innovation happens when there's a crisis. So first up, the pandemic sent a really strong, clear, ubiquitous message that innovation was expected, that we needed to do things differently. That isn't always the case. In government, innovation is usually one of a multitude of different agendas. There's always many, many policy aims trying to achieve. And most rational public servants are going to focus on things that are easier to do because they want to make progress. Innovation is inherently messy, confusing, ambiguous, and uncertain. So sometimes it needs that boost. What the crisis did was say, we need innovation. It's send that signal all throughout the public sector. Second, what we saw is that the bias towards existing options was gone. Our usual bias to known and well understood options was removed. So when decision makers were sitting around a table or virtual table, they didn't have the option of going, well, let's just do what we always do because we know and understand that. They had to go, well, we must look at different options, whether it was moving abruptly to digital service delivery or staff working from home. Again, in the public sector, decision makers are biased to things they know because you want to rely on strategies that you're comfortable with, you understand how they work. Well, what the crisis did was say, nope, you can't rely on those. They aren't going to work as well as you think. So it rebalanced between we must think about new options and the dangers of sticking with the status quo. Third, there was a huge amount of investment in new capabilities by government. Our usual bias for well-established capabilities was overcome by this need to do things differently. So I know in organizations I work with or friends worked in, all of a sudden overnight, you have to work from home, or well, we don't know how, or we don't have the tools and platforms needed. Normally, government's really good at going, well, tough. In this situation, decision makers had to go, well, we need this to happen. We need this to work. So all of a sudden, new technologies were unlocked. Investment was found to help people adjust. That's, again, very different to the normal, where we tend to rely on things we know we've invested in before. Then fourth, doing something unusual, different, felt perfectly normal. And indeed, the old way of working is sometimes even impossible or illegal. Everyone expected to work in different ways. Normally, the public sector is very good at going, why are you doing something different? Who said you could do that? Why is that allowed? We didn't have that in this situation. So if we draw from those lessons, we can form what the OECD with that model, that you have 4 underlying factors of why innovation can occur in the public sector. You've got to have a reason, you've got to have the possibility of it, you've got to have the capability to actually carry it out, and you have to have the experience or feedback loop that means it'll keep on going. And then if you look over on the right, in the system, well, what we saw was that clarity about innovation. You had a very strong, clear message. You had what we call parity of innovation, that there was equal footing between new ideas and old ways of doing things. There was suitability for innovation in that we were prepared to invest in new ways of working, despite having invested a lot in old ways of working. And we had that normality around innovation. So when all of those things align, a huge amount of innovation can be unlocked. So what I'm suggesting is to understand, ensure that those conditions can exist outside of a crisis. We can't always rely on a crisis because it's very, very stressful and very, very tiring for public servants and for citizens. We want to be in a situation where we can drive change before it's absolutely necessary, before a pandemic forces us all to be able to work from home, or before it shoves everyone into digital service delivery. How do we ensure that governments can engage in these things before they're needed? So that's where some of the work of the OECD has been about, is thinking about, well, how do leaders and others send a really strong, clear message? How do you make how do you make existing doing things to continue on when there are ways available? How do you ensure that you invest in new capabilities before they're needed? And how do you make it seem normal to do things a bit differently? And finally, I want to just introduce this other model that we call the innovation facets model that was developed at the OECD, which is about helping to understand that governments need a mix of innovation activity. So we have one word, innovation, to describe 4 very different types of activity. There's that mission-oriented innovation that Mehmet mentioned at the beginning, whether it's a big audacious goal like putting someone on the moon, or an energy transformation, or something else. It's a big goal that demands change from the rest of the system. We have enhancement-oriented innovation, which is more incremental. So the use of behavioral insight, for instance, where you're trying to leverage the most out of what you've already been doing. There's adaptive innovation, which is that much more bottom-up, where you're responding to changes on the ground. And anticipatory innovation, which is where you're trying to engage with weak signals before they're locked in. So a classic example is, how did governments mostly respond to social media? Well, in a lot of countries, they took a wait and see approach. And now they're starting to go, hang on, maybe that wasn't the best idea. It's much harder though, once something is locked in place, to change it. It's much easier to change things when they're weak, but the case for changing it is much harder to make. And what I've seen and found is that thinking about a portfolio of innovation activity can really help, because it's people, there are different types of innovation, and whichever type you're doing is probably okay. But that we need this complementary mix, because if whatever the next crisis will be, it'll probably be in that anticipatory space. And we need governments to be investing and playing in that space, so that we're ready or better prepared for whatever might come. We can't prevent it, we can't predict it, but we can build the capabilities that put us in a better position for whatever that might be. And same with the other types of innovation. We need that mix. We need to support those different types of innovations in different ways. And what the crisis has shown is that if we just rely on a crisis, you can get a huge amount of change happen in a very short period of time, but you're not going to get a balanced portfolio. And that's a problem. So that's quite a lot, but I'll leave some links that point to some relevant publications or work on those things. And the last is my own personal site. But I hope that just gives you a sense of what I think the crisis has shown us is, yes, they can drive innovation and can be really powerful levers for change, but we cannot and should not rely on that to drive change. We need to think about how to systematize innovation as a capability, create the conditions and the structures that mean we encourage people to be innovating before they have to. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for your discussions about how we should respond to a crisis and to innovate. So I'll hand over my chair to Biao Huang to coordinate the discussions and Q&A. Biao?
Yes, thank you, Professor Ma, and thank you, our three speakers. I think we still have some time for Professor Barry, a very distinguished professor in the field of public policy and innovation. And Professor Barry, for your discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoyed the presenters, and I will just make a few comments about each paper, so there's time for discussion and questions from everybody else. First, let me thank Liang and Huang, Biao, and also Elaine for organizing this. And it's good to see you all. It's been way too long since we have gotten together. I have other friends on the Zoom, and it's very nice to just see everybody talking about this topic. Let me start with the last paper first. I really liked Alex's last slide, the facets of innovation. If he was talking with about strategic planning and mentoring, he'd probably be talking about emergent innovation on the bottom and then more the top-down planned innovation. I think, Alex, you're very optimistic to think that anticipatory innovation is going to happen at a greater pace in government. I think that's unlikely. It requires a lot of rationality. It requires a lot of money invested for R&D. And at least what we see in the US, and I realize the US is very unusual among the major countries of the world, is that it's the it's Elon Musk and Tesla and his fortune. It's the Google fortune. It's the Microsoft fortune. It's a lot of other entities that are part business, part nonprofit, that are doing a lot of the innovation. Social enterprises around the world are doing part of this, and they also look very different from country to country. But, I was listening to Professor Demircioglu. You were talking about the Bell Labs. That was a fabulous experiment in the US for 30, 40 years, but it was government funded with the idea of develop new technology, do things that you think will make society better. We don't do that anymore in US government, except through medical research and so forth, and through defense projects, which don't always result in innovations for us as civilians. So I would say, Alex, one of the things that I have 3 points from your presentation. First is that I think crisis management has been shown through COVID not to work. So, you talked about that we our bias towards existing options are gone. And I think that's very true. And our crisis management approaches for hurricanes and typhoons and so forth have not worked for COVID. So we're really developing new crisis management approaches. And I think it's still too early to know exactly what those are going to look like. A lot of what is going to come out of this depends on what lessons government leaders learn and what lessons citizens insist are either learned or practiced for the future. I think one of the things that all the presentations really did not touch enough on are government and citizen interaction. I think whether you call this culture, whether you talk about how citizens view policies and procedures, certainly in the US, this is like probably the top issue for us to try to deal with COVID, because our citizens are so individualistic and unruly and not willing to follow directives. I know it's better in other countries, but I think that this whole COVID mess that we're in is going to radically reshape citizen and government interaction. And the communication channels that we in government have to develop to gain back trust and to gain confidence are going to need to be really examined. I think we need to innovate there maybe as much as anywhere. So that also, Professor Demircioglu mentioned a number of times about kind of the citizen-state interaction. In my work, including my work in China with Yi Hongtao and Chen Wenna, who is finishing her PhD at Hong Kong University, we looked at the transfer of innovators from province to province and use a dependent variable of energy pollution reduction, and found that a high-performing innovators who were transferred resulted in a 3% annual decrease in pollution, which was a huge percentage given the lagged dependency on past time. So I think in terms of a few comments then to Professor Teets, who I really enjoyed your work, I would argue that one need to look at, I believe, does this vary by innovation area or policy area? So you conclude that there's going to be less experimentation, more risk aversion, and so forth. I wonder if that's true across all policy areas or mostly across areas where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of political uncertainty about what is favorable or not. I would guess that for something like pollution reduction, that's going to continue to be an area that people aren't going to be risk averse on. So maybe one of the things we learned from your study is that coming through a very risky time of COVID is that government managers will start reassessing what is risk allowing and what they need to be really risk averse towards, both to their political leaders and aid or principals, as well as to citizens. I really found it fascinating that you have the 4 types and the strategic autocrat. But I would encourage you, if you could possibly look at policy or program area or some kind of tabulation that gets more into the weeds rather than just willingness to innovate, that would be helpful for making these, relatively large statements. I also wondered whether you included, whether you asked people if they would be about them individually or about others in their local government, because I think that the findings might be somewhat different. So that would be just something to consider, is how you interpolate from their surveys what it means for the group, the population essentially that you sampled, even though I realize as a convenient sample, you can't have quite the same generalizability, but still it's a very interesting survey. And I guess the other thing is there any way to assess whether the institutional structures differ, or, just sort of, I know local governments in China are not as diverse probably as in some countries, including the US, but still, I would think that really looking at some of the structural or institutional issues would be important, just like with the policy issues, so that you can continue to make these kinds of assertions, but on a more specific level. And then let's see, I think, I guess one of the things that really came to me from all of your presentations was that when we look at innovation, I think there's been a tremendous amount of horizontal innovation through COVID-19. And in response to, is there more collaboration or not? Horizontally, I think agencies and cities have had to collaborate like crazy. Now, whether that will continue, whether they see themselves as trustworthy partners, I think the networks of public health response that have emerged in COVID-19, it will be fascinating to see if they continue into broader crisis management areas, and if the horizontal networks that have been strengthened in COVID, they certainly have been in the US. I don't know, again, if that's a tremendous generalization, but my sense is that, as you all mentioned, just responding to the public health and the urgent issues required much more networked collaboration among local government or county government or so forth. And I guess I would say the last thing maybe is how COVID will change the relationships between sectors, nonprofit, business, and government, and also across countries. And to some extent, it seems like this is going to be based on networks that have developed, have been strengthened or weakened through COVID, and also, of course, the local political culture. As we know, of course, I'm talking from the US, but I read widely. I mean, the US political culture is just totally fragmented, and COVID has just, it's like an atom bomb, has bursted apart with disinformation, with citizen distrust, with so many negative reactions by citizens and government to COVID and what government is trying to do. I'm really not sure how innovation is going to come out of this, except through just devoted efforts at whatever level an entrepreneur can push through. But we see somebody like Governor Cuomo, who was king of the hill in New York, and a few months later, accusations from women of his abuse came out, and the next thing we knew, he was no longer governor. So it's just been a chaotic process. And the very last thing is, are governments going to prioritize the economy or public health? And I do think that to some extent, one or the other has to be given a priority. So I think that in terms of policy making and perhaps in terms of innovation is going to be an issue directly related to what comes out of COVID-19. There, I really enjoyed all the papers, and I look forward to hearing other people's questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Professor Barry, for your very well commenting. And I would like to ask whether our three speakers got some response to the comments.
Just a quick one from me.
Yeah,
I agree, Francis. I was being optimistic, but it's also a matter of pessimistic in that anticipatory innovation has to happen. It doesn't necessarily all have to happen in government, but if it's going to happen outside of government, government needs to be better aware and engaged with it. And I guess my position would be that if we keep things as they are, then yes, it's very optimistic, but we cannot afford to keep things as they are. We have to build in structures and processes that force governments to reassess their current portfolio mix. We have to introduce, whether it's through accountability or other structural forces that push governments to invest in these things, because the costs of not doing so are so enormous. But a matter of debate.
Okay, Alex. So Jessica or Mehmet?
Yeah, thanks,
Yes.
Dr. Frances Beres. I appreciate for comments. And I agree with you that we don't see much discussion between government-citizen interaction. And maybe it may be, hopefully we can see more studies, because I think one of the issues that we see in different countries, including maybe Australia, was not really, citizens are not really involved in decisions. And maybe I'll share the one actually extra slide and try to kind of also brainstorm. So there is one movie, I don't know, maybe some maybe watch it, like Suli. So there is a podcast, I think last week. So I really enjoyed the podcast. So Francesco talks with Shankar, and so basically, I mean, you know the movie. So as it's also seen here, they landed to the river, Hudson River, because they had to make decision very quick. And they basically, the person, like the pilot, was so experienced that he just calculated very quickly, well, there is no way that he could land in a like airport, right? So sometimes I think it reminded me also of the COVID-19 crisis. Maybe we don't have like 5 minutes, but we may have maybe 2 days to decide whether should we close the border, or I don't know, maybe 2 hours. So, I mean, not me, but policymakers. And so in these cases, the policymakers may make a mistake. So, however, in the TED Talks, it's also mentioned that the pilot has so much experience. And so the experience, I had also an extra slide. So the experiments and experimentations matter a lot. However, there is also the comfort zone. So when a policymaker or innovator becomes so experienced, he or she may think that, well, I know, so I don't need to collaborate, right? I don't need to listen to citizens. Maybe somewhat a negative side of extreme meritocratic system, I would say. And so here, the TED Talks also mentioned that, well, we need to be challenged. Maybe we need to have the people who think differently, who have different experience, knowledge, and from socioeconomic, maybe like also backgrounds as well. And I think maybe to answer maybe to the comments of Dr. Berry, I would also think that, well, yes, maybe we need to consult with citizens, and the question becomes, how can we do it, right? While we had to make essential decisions and considering not only the short-term outcomes, but in the longer-term outcomes as well, not only public health or psychological, physical health, but also psychological health. So this becomes, I think, very challenging. And so I'm glad that practitioners like Alex, and I mean, they are working on they are working on how to make innovations during the crisis. So.
Thank you, Mehmet.
Thanks,
yeah, Jessica.
Thank you for the feedback. I think that as far as the variation across the different innovation areas, we do see that it's fairly predictable in that it tends to be the innovation that's the safest we see more of. So that's not too surprising, but we do see it. But I think the really interesting innovation is more of what you were pointing to with regional variation. And, you know, there what we see, and we're actually right writing a research note right now, just trying to look at that data. We see surprisingly different patterns across different regions. And some of the patterns, I think a lot of us who've been to a lot of places in China might predict, like Shandong is fairly conservative. So we would probably predict that. Guangdong is fairly liberal. We would probably predict that. But then there are some surprises, as in Anhui sort of being more liberal, trying to listen to citizens more and collect more citizen feedback. And that's not normally exactly what I would think of about Anhui. So we are seeing a lot of regional variation there. That's really interesting. So we're trying to work through that data to figure out if there is anything behind it. There are the structural differences of being in different types of provinces, like socioeconomic conditions. But also, as you pointed out with your work, we also see the transfer of top officials from one province to another. And as we've seen in a lot of research, these experiments are carried sort of by these people from one place to another. So right now we're trying to pull all of that apart to see if there is an interesting story there with regional variation. But thank you for that feedback. I was wondering if I should keep working on it, but now that I have your feedback, I think I should keep going.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, and thank you all of our speakers and our discussant. It is a very great honor to have all of you here to discuss what is innovation and what is challenge it needs under the pandemic. I think I very much agree with the Mehmet's judgment that under a very uncertainty situation, we have to make decisions in a very, very short time. And sometimes we need to think about how to deal with the time cost and the long-term consideration. And what policy innovation will go, we do not know. Actually, before we organize in the dialogue, I discussing with Professor Liang, and he would like to discuss about the dark side of the innovation. And maybe we will find that under the pandemic, sometimes, as Alex said, that innovation is more needed, but we also can find that innovation sometimes make the policy response very fragmented. So it is a very variable, and for me, it's a very insightful discussion today. I think because the time is already past, actually, past the 10 o'clock, our time is ready. Very sorry for all the audience, and we do not have the time for Q&A, but we still would like to express our deep appreciation to all our speakers and our discussant, Professor Barry. Thank you very much for participating in the dialogue. I think we still have at least 2 dialogue about more ideas and topics about the public policy and administration topics. So please pay attention to our WeChat account and our Twitter or Facebook account. We will have more chance to meet each other again. Thank you. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.